a major river crossing in contested territory, 0900 hours on a recent winter morning, cold water, swift current, a natural defensive barrier that had to be overcome. A Russian motorized rifle division, 4,800 combat soldiers supported by mechanized vehicles and artillery, prepared to execute a river crossing operation using 3 pontoon bridges constructed simultaneously. The operation was planned meticulously. Engineers had rehearsed bridge construction. Infantry had trained for rapid crossing. The objective was to establish a bridgehead on the far bank and exploit inland before Ukrainian forces could respond. 29 hours later, the operation would be remembered as one of the worst river crossing disasters in modern military history. 1,847 soldiers dead, 412 drowned, 141 captured, all 3 bridges destroyed, 2,400 soldiers trapped on the far bank, systematically annihilated. This happened days ago. The river still carries bodies downstream. Bridge wreckage remains visible. The far bank is littered with Russian dead. This is what occurred. River crossing operations are among the most complex and dangerous military maneuvers. Forces are vulnerable during crossing. Equipment must be moved across water. Units become separated. Command and control is difficult. Success requires speed, coordination, and enemy suppression. Russian planning called for simultaneous bridge construction at 3 points along a 10-kilometer sector. This approach distributed vulnerability and created multiple crossing points to accelerate force flow. Engineers would construct pontoon bridges while artillery suppressed Ukrainian positions on the far bank. Ukrainian forces observed Russian preparations for days. Bridge construction equipment was identified. Crossing points were predicted, troop concentrations were tracked, and Ukrainian command made a calculated decision: allow the crossing to begin, wait for maximum Russian commitment, then destroy the bridges with forces trapped on the far bank. This strategy accepted initial tactical setbacks to create strategic opportunities. Allowing Russians to cross seemed counterintuitive, but if forces could be trapped on the far bank and destroyed, the strategic gain would exceed the tactical cost of surrendering territory. Bridge construction began at 0700. Russian engineers deployed pontoon sections, connected spans, and secured anchoring. Artillery fired smoke rounds to conceal operations. Infantry provided security against potential Ukrainian interference. Ukrainian forces observed, but didn't engage. Artillery remained silent. Infantry stayed in concealed positions. Russian engineers interpreted this as successful suppression or enemy absence. In reality, Ukrainian forces were waiting. By 0930, all 3 bridges were complete and operational. Russian command immediately began crossing operations. Infantry crossed first to establish security on the far bank, followed by mechanized vehicles, artillery, and logistics. The crossing proceeded rapidly. By 10:30, 800 soldiers had crossed. By 1100, 1,500. By 11:30, 2,400 soldiers and significant equipment were on the far bank. Additional forces continued crossing. Ukrainian observers tracked the numbers precisely. Drone surveillance provided real-time counting. Intelligence officers calculated force ratios. The assessment: enough Russian forces had crossed to create a significant trapped element, but not so many that they could defend effectively. At 11:34, Ukrainian artillery initiated simultaneous fires on all 3 bridges. The strikes were precise and devastating. HIMARS rockets targeted bridge centers. Artillery engaged bridge approaches and exits. The objective was complete destruction of crossing capability. Bridge 1, the northern crossing, was struck by 2 HIMARS rockets. The pontoon sections were blown apart, sinking immediately. 90 Russian soldiers were on the bridge during the strike. Most were thrown into the water by the blast. Many drowned immediately, pulled under by heavy equipment and swift current. Bridge 2, the center crossing, was engaged by concentrated artillery fire. High explosive rounds detonated along the bridge span. Pontoon sections ruptured and sank. 120 soldiers were crossing. The bridge collapsed beneath them. Soldiers fell into water wearing full combat loads, armor, weapons, ammunition. The weight pulled them under. Few survived. Bridge 3, the southern crossing, was targeted by both HIMARS and artillery. The bridge didn't just collapse, it was obliterated. Fuel trucks were crossing when the strike occurred. The rockets penetrated the trucks' tanks, igniting diesel fuel. The bridge became an inferno. Soldiers on the bridge burned or jumped into freezing water. Survival rate was nearly zero. Within 8 minutes, all 3 bridges were destroyed. 2,400 Russian soldiers were trapped on the far bank. Additional forces on the near bank were cut off from supporting them. The river, 200 meters wide with swift current and near freezing water, was now an impassable barrier. Russian command immediately recognized the catastrophe. Orders were transmitted to forces on the far bank. Establish defensive perimeter, consolidate positions, await bridge reconstruction or alternative crossing. Ukrainian forces began systematic destruction of the trapped force. Artillery engaged Russian positions on the far bank continuously. Drones provided targeting data. HIMARS struck concentrations of vehicles and equipment. Russian soldiers on the far bank attempted to dig defensive positions in rocky soil, attempted to find cover in sparse terrain, attempted to establish command posts and ammunition points. Ukrainian fires found everything. At 1200 hours, Ukrainian forces destroyed all fuel trucks that had crossed with the Russian force. Without fuel, mechanized vehicles were immobilized. Tanks couldn't maneuver, infantry fighting vehicles couldn't reposition. The trapped force was static. At 1300 hours, ammunition storage points were targeted. Explosions detonated stored ammunition, killing soldiers nearby and eliminating combat supplies. Russian forces were low on ammunition, with no resupply possible. Helicopter evacuation was attempted at 1330. 2 Mi-8 transport helicopters approached the far bank to evacuate wounded. Ukrainian air defense engaged both helicopters with man-portable missiles. Both were shot down, all crew and passengers killed. Helicopter evacuation was deemed impossible. Some Russian soldiers attempted to swim back across the river. The water temperature was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. The current was 2 meters per second. Soldiers wore full combat equipment, armor vests, helmets, weapons, ammunition. A group of 23 soldiers entered the water at 1400 hours. They removed some equipment but retained weapons and essential gear. The current was too strong. The cold was debilitating. Hypothermia set in within minutes. All 23 drowned. Bodies were recovered downstream hours later. Additional swim attempts occurred throughout the afternoon. Every attempt ended in drowning. Soldiers in full combat gear cannot swim effectively in swift, cold water. The attempts were desperate acts by men who knew they were trapped. Russian command organized a relief operation at 1500 hours. Forces on the near bank would attempt to construct new bridges or establish ferry operations. Engineers moved forward with pontoon equipment. Ukrainian artillery engaged bridge construction attempts immediately. Any effort to deploy pontoons drew concentrated fires. Engineers suffered heavy casualties. Equipment was destroyed. Bridge reconstruction proved impossible under fire. Night fell. Russian forces on the far bank had been isolated for 6 hours. Ammunition was depleted. Fuel was gone. Food was limited. Medical supplies were inadequate for treating casualties. Morale was collapsing. Ukrainian forces continued harassment fires throughout the night. Artillery rounds landed randomly across Russian positions every 10 to 15 minutes. Soldiers couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't recover from the day's trauma. Radio intercepts captured Russian communications. Officers reported catastrophic situations, requested immediate evacuation, begged for relief. Higher command provided reassurances, but no concrete assistance. The trapped force was being abandoned. Dawn of Day 2 revealed the extent of destruction. Bodies littered the far bank, Destroyed vehicles burned. Defensive positions were cratered by overnight artillery. The trapped force had suffered approximately 400 casualties during the night. Ukrainian forces launched coordinated ground assault at 0400 on day 2. Fresh units attacked Russian positions from multiple directions. The defenders were exhausted, low on ammunition, demoralized. Resistance was fragmented. Russian units fell back from forward positions, consolidated into smaller perimeters, attempted to establish final defensive lines. Ukrainian forces advanced steadily, reducing pockets of resistance systematically. At 0630, a Russian battalion commander transmitted surrender offer to Ukrainian forces. His unit was combat ineffective. Ammunition was exhausted. Further resistance would only result in additional unnecessary deaths. He requested terms for surrender. Ukrainian command accepted surrender. Ceasefire was established for that sector. 141 Russian soldiers, including the battalion commander and several company officers, surrendered. They were processed and evacuated to prisoner facilities. Other Russian units continued fighting. Some officers refused to consider surrender, ordered troops to fight to the last. These units were systematically destroyed by Ukrainian assault forces. By noon on day 2, organized Russian resistance on the far bank had ceased. Surviving soldiers either surrendered, died fighting, or attempted to hide in terrain. Ukrainian forces swept the area, clearing remaining pockets. The final casualty count was devastating: 1,847 Russian soldiers killed or wounded from the original 2,400 trapped on the far bank. 412 drowned attempting to swim across the river. 141 taken prisoner. Fewer than 400 escaped or evaded capture. Equipment losses were total. All vehicles that crossed the bridges were destroyed or captured. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery pieces, logistics trucks, everything lost. The equipment value exceeded $340 million. Bodies continued washing up downstream for days. Russian recovery teams collected drowned soldiers from riverbanks kilometers below the crossing site. Many bodies were never recovered, swept away by current. The tactical lessons were damning for Russian planning. River crossing operations require secure bridges and continuous logistics. The operation proceeded without adequate air defense, allowing Ukrainian forces to destroy bridges at will. No alternative crossing capability was prepared. Forces were committed without contingency planning for bridge loss. Ukrainian operational planning demonstrated sophisticated patience and timing. Allowing the crossing to proceed lured Russian forces into committing maximum strength. Destroying bridges at the optimal moment created a trapped force that could be annihilated. The strategy accepted tactical risk for strategic gain. The psychological impact on Russian survivors was severe. Soldiers who witnessed the disaster reported feeling abandoned by command. Promised relief never arrived. Bridge reconstruction never occurred. They watched comrades drown attempting desperate escape. Russian families demanded accountability. Why were bridges destroyed so easily? Why was no alternative crossing prepared? Why were trapped soldiers not evacuated? The questions created political pressure on military leadership. Russian military analysts published harsh criticism. One channel wrote, "This is criminally incompetent planning. We crossed a major river without air defense, without bridge protection, without alternative crossing capability. We sent 4,000 soldiers into a trap and abandoned them. This is murder through negligence." The strategic impact extended beyond direct losses. The division was rendered combat ineffective, requiring months to reconstitute. Offensive operations planned for this sector were cancelled. Russian forces lost initiative and momentum. Ukrainian forces demonstrated that properly executed defensive operations could defeat numerically superior enemies through maneuver and fires. The engagement validated doctrine emphasizing patience, timing, and exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities. The river crossing site remains marked by wreckage days later. Destroyed bridge sections visible in shallow water. burned vehicles on the far bank, bodies still being recovered from downstream locations. The numbers define the catastrophe: 2,400 soldiers trapped, 1,847 casualties, 412 drowned, 141 captured, all 3 bridges destroyed, $340 million in equipment lost, 29 hours from bridge completion to final surrender. This is river crossing warfare, where bridges become death traps, where natural barriers become killing grounds, where trapped forces are systematically annihilated. The bridges are destroyed, the far bank is a graveyard, the river carries bodies to the sea, and Russian forces learn that river crossings without security, without alternatives, without contingency planning are not operations. They are massacres. Welcome to warfare where water is a weapon, where bridges are choke points, where tactical impatience creates strategic catastrophe.